Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where history meets the pillow and geography gets cozy. Tonight, we're diving into one of Africa's most fascinating and frankly bizarre countries, a place that's managed to fly completely under everyone's radar despite sitting on more oil than a McDonald's fryer. This is the story of Equatorial Guinea, and trust me, it's wilder than any bedtime story your grandmother ever told you. Chapter 1. Welcome to Africa's best-kept secret. Picture this. There's a country in Africa where Spanish is the official language, but it's not in North Africa where you might expect some European influence. No, this place is smack dab in the heart of Equatorial Africa, surrounded by French-speaking nations, looking about as linguistically out of place as a taco truck at a sushi convention. And here's the kicker. Despite the name Equatorial Guinea, the actual equator doesn't even pass through the country. It's like calling yourself Tall John when you're 5'3". The equator runs about 60 miles south of the mainland, which means the country's name is technically geographic false advertising. Equatorial Guinea consists of two very different parts that are separated by hundreds of miles of ocean, which is rather like having your bedroom in New York and your kitchen in Philadelphia. It's a logistical nightmare that somehow works. The mainland portion, called Río Muni, sits nestled between Cameroon to the north and Gabon, wrapping around the east and south like an overly affectionate relative at a family reunion. Then, scattered across the Gulf of Guinea like someone dropped a handful of emeralds into the ocean, you have 5 islands. The largest and most important is Bioko Island, where the capital city of Malabo perches like a tropical crown jewel. Now, let's talk numbers for a moment, because Equatorial Guinea is delightfully tiny in all the right ways. The entire country covers just 28,050 square kilometers, which makes it slightly smaller than Maryland, but significantly more interesting than most of Maryland. No offense to Maryland residents listening tonight. To put this in perspective, you could drive across the entire mainland in about 3 hours if the roads were decent, which they're not, but we'll get to infrastructure challenges later. The country has a population of roughly 1.8 million people, which means if everyone in Equatorial Guinea decided to have a barbecue together, they'd need a space about the size of downtown Phoenix. The islands tell their own geographical story, and it's a volcanic one. Bioko Island rises from the sea like nature's own skyscraper, with 3 impressive peaks that would make any mountain proud. The highest point, Pico Basil, reaches 3,011 meters into the sky, which is tall enough that you could theoretically get altitude sickness while still technically being on a small African island. The island is shaped rather like a boot, which is either a cosmic coincidence or nature's way of suggesting that Equatorial Guinea should start making footwear instead of just extracting oil. The coastline around Bioko is particularly dramatic. Imagine if someone took a regular tropical island and decided it needed more personality. The southern shores are steep and rugged, like nature was feeling particularly artistic that day, while the northern coast offers gentler beaches and excellent harbours. It's as if the island can't decide whether it wants to be intimidating or welcoming, so it chose to be both, depending on which direction you're approaching from. But here's where things get really interesting from a geographical perspective. Equatorial Guinea discovered massive oil reserves in 1995 and almost overnight went from being one of the poorest countries in Africa to having one of the highest GDP per capita figures on the continent. It's like winning the lottery, except instead of buying scratch-off tickets at a gas station, they just happen to be sitting on top of billions of barrels of crude oil. The transformation was so rapid and dramatic that economists are still studying it as a textbook example of how natural resources can completely reshape a nation's prospects, though whether that reshaping has been entirely positive is a story for later sections. The oil discovery turned this sleepy former Spanish colony into Africa's 3rd largest oil producer, behind only Nigeria and Angola. By 2005, the country was pumping out 380,000 barrels per day, which is enough oil to fill about 60 Olympic swimming pools daily. To put this in context, that's more oil per capita than Kuwait or the United Arab Emirates were producing at their peaks. For a country that most people couldn't locate on a map if you spotted them the continent, this was quite the geological jackpot. The timing of this discovery was particularly fortuitous, or perhaps unfortunate, depending on your perspective. Equatorial Guinea had just emerged from one of the most brutal dictatorships in African history, a period so traumatic that the country's population had actually decreased by a third. So when American oil companies led by Mobil Corporation showed up with drilling equipment and investment capital, it was like a rescue boat arriving at a shipwreck, except the rescue boat came with its own set of complications that we'll explore as our story unfolds. What makes Equatorial Guinea's geography particularly unique is how the oil transformed not just the economy, but the physical landscape itself. Where there were once cocoa plantations and subsistence farms, suddenly there were gleaming office towers and luxury hotels sprouting from the rainforest like very expensive mushrooms. The government began constructing entirely new cities from scratch, carving them out of plantation lands and pristine forest with the enthusiasm of someone playing SimCity with unlimited funds and questionable urban planning skills. The capital city of Malabo, perched on Bioko Island, became a surreal blend of traditional African architecture and oil boom modernism. Imagine if someone took a traditional West African fishing village and gave it a makeover by a Las Vegas architect who had perhaps consumed too much caffeine. Gleaming glass towers rose beside colonial-era buildings, while luxury hotels catered to oil executives who flew in from Houston and London, creating an economic ecosystem that was both fascinating and somewhat dystopian. But perhaps the most geographically intriguing aspect of modern Equatorial Guinea is how isolated the country remains despite its wealth. Those 5 islands scattered across the Gulf of Guinea aren't just charming geographical features, they're logistical challenges that would make Amazon delivery executives weep. Getting from the mainland to the capital requires either a flight or a boat journey, and neither option is what you'd call convenient or particularly reliable. It's like trying to run a modern nation from a series of very expensive tropical tree houses. The mainland portion, Río Muni, tells its own geographical story. Behind the narrow coastal plain, the land rises into an elevated plateau, covered in some of the most spectacular tropical rainforest you'll find anywhere on Earth. These forests are so dense and biodiverse that scientists are still discovering new species on a regular basis, which is impressive considering that most of the world's rainforests have been pretty thoroughly catalogued by now. It's as if nature decided to save some surprises for the one country that most people forget exists. Rivers snake through this landscape like nature's own highway system, though calling them highways might be overly optimistic since most of them are about as navigable as a shopping cart with a broken wheel. The Utamboni River flows through the south, while various smaller rivers create a network of waterways that were once the primary means of transportation before oil money started building actual roads, some of which are even paved, which counts as luxury infrastructure in this part of the world. The climate, as you might expect from a country that almost touches the equator, is what meteorologists politely call tropical, and what everyone else calls perpetually sticky. Temperatures hover consistently between 28 and 32 degrees Celsius, which means that seasonal variation is about as noticeable as the difference between very hot coffee and slightly less very hot coffee. The humidity is the kind that makes you understand why siestas were invented, and why every building with oil money behind it features aggressive air conditioning. Rainfall in Equatorial Guinea follows a pattern that can best be described as enthusiastic. The wet season, which runs roughly from April to October, brings the kind of downpours that make Noah's flood look like a light sprinkle. Coastal regions can receive up to 400 millimeters of rain per month during peak season, which is enough water to make you question humanity's decision to settle in places where the sky periodically turns into a fire hose. This brings us to one of the more amusing geographical contradictions of modern Equatorial Guinea. It's simultaneously one of the wettest places on Earth, and one where many residents lack access to clean drinking water. It's like being surrounded by food but starving because you can't figure out how to use a can opener, a metaphor that unfortunately applies to several aspects of how the country's oil wealth has been managed, or rather, mismanaged. The islands of Equatorial Guinea each have their own personalities, geographically speaking. Annobon, the most distant island, sits almost 400 miles southwest of Bioko and is so isolated that its residents developed their own Portuguese-based Creole language. It's like the geographical equivalent of that one relative who moved to Alaska and started a llama farm, technically part of the family, but operating on entirely different principles. The smaller islands, Corisco, Great Elobay, and Little Elobay, cluster near the mainland coast like nervous satellites afraid to venture too far from home. These islands are so small and obscure that they make Bioko look like Manhattan by comparison. Some of them are so tiny that a brisk walk would take you around their entire perimeter in under an hour, assuming you could find someone to give you directions, which is unlikely since their combined population is smaller than most suburban high schools. What's particularly fascinating about Equatorial Guinea's geographical position is how it sits at the intersection of several major African cultural and linguistic zones. You have the Spanish colonial legacy creating this linguistic island in a sea of French and Portuguese influence, while the underlying Bantu ethnic groups maintain cultural connections that stretch across Central Africa. It's like a geographical crossroads, where history got confused and decided to try everything at once. The country's position also makes it a fascinating study in how geography shapes economics. Those offshore oil deposits didn't form by accident. They're the result of millions of years of geological processes that created perfect conditions for hydrocarbon formation in the Gulf of Guinea. The same tectonic forces that created the dramatic volcanic islands also created the underwater formations that trapped ancient organic matter and slowly cooked it into liquid gold, or black gold, to be more accurate. As we settle in for this journey through Equatorial Guinea's remarkable story, it's worth remembering that geography isn't just about maps and measurements. It's about how landscape shapes culture, how resources influence politics, and how a small country with big discoveries can find itself playing on the world stage whether it's ready or not. Tonight, we're going to explore how this tiny, linguistically confused, geographically scattered nation became one of Africa's wealthiest countries per capita, and whether that wealth has been a blessing or a curse. Spoiler alert, it's complicated. So, make yourself comfortable, perhaps adjust your pillow, and prepare to discover a country that most of the world has forgotten exists despite the fact that it produces enough oil to fuel several small nations and has a political history that reads like a particularly dark fairy tale. This is Equatorial Guinea, Africa's best-kept secret, for better and for worse. Chapter 2. From Prehistoric Times to Colonial Confusion. As we settle deeper into our journey through Equatorial Guinea's remarkable story, let's travel back in time to when this corner of Africa was home to some of humanity's earliest inhabitants. Before there were oil rigs dotting the horizon or Spanish colonial administrators scratching their heads over tropical diseases, this land was populated by peoples whose history stretches back tens of thousands of years, though sadly, much of their story has been lost to time, colonial neglect, and the unfortunate tendency of history to be written by whoever had the biggest ships and the loudest cannons. The earliest confirmed inhabitants of what we now call Equatorial Guinea were the Pygmies, and when I say earliest, I mean these folks were setting up camp in Central African rainforests before most of humanity had figured out that agriculture was a good idea. Pygmy peoples have lived in Central Africa for an estimated 130,000 years, which means they were here watching ice ages come and go while the rest of humanity was still trying to master the art of not being eaten by saber-toothed cats. Today, only small isolated pockets of pygmy communities remain in northern Río Muni, specifically groups called the Bayele and Bokwin, who inhabit the Altos den Sork region like living reminders of a much older world. These pygmy groups developed a semi-nomadic lifestyle centered around hunting and gathering that was so perfectly adapted to the rainforest environment that it remained virtually unchanged for millennia. They were like the ultimate survival experts, knowing every edible plant, every animal track, and every seasonal pattern in one of the world's most challenging environments. However, their traditional way of life has been increasingly threatened by deforestation, encroachment from other ethnic groups, and the kind of modernization that treats ancient wisdom as an inconvenience rather than a treasure. Around 2000 BC, a massive migration began that would reshape the demographic landscape of Central Africa forever. This was the Bantu expansion, one of humanity's great population movements that spread Bantu-speaking peoples from their homeland in what is now southeastern Nigeria and northwestern Cameroon across vast swaths of sub-Saharan Africa. Think of it as the ancient African equivalent of westward expansion in America, except it took place over centuries rather than decades, and involved considerably fewer covered wagons and significantly more sophisticated agricultural techniques. The Bantu migrants who settled in what would become Equatorial Guinea brought with them revolutionary technologies like ironworking, advanced agricultural practices, and social organization systems that were light years ahead of what had existed before. They practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, crop rotation, and forest management techniques that allowed them to live sustainably in the rainforest environment. It's rather ironic that these supposedly primitive peoples had figured out sustainable rainforest management thousands of years before modern industrial civilization decided that clear-cutting everything was a brilliant idea. By 500 BC at the latest, these Bantu groups had established themselves throughout continental Equatorial Guinea, developing into distinct ethnic groups with their own languages, customs, and territorial boundaries. The largest and most successful of these groups were the Fang people, who would eventually come to dominate the mainland region. The Fang were remarkably organized, developing a centralized society with a strong military structure that was sophisticated enough to resist early European attempts at colonization, which, considering that early European colonizers had a tendency to show up with diseases, guns, and extremely questionable moral compasses, was no small achievement. The islands of Equatorial Guinea tell a slightly different story. Bioko Island, the largest and most important of the islands, wasn't settled until much later than the mainland. The earliest confirmed settlements on Bioko date to around 530 AD, which means the island remained uninhabited for quite a while after the mainland had bustling Bantu communities. When people did finally make it to Bioko, they brought with them the ancestors of what would become the Bubi people, who developed their own distinct culture and language perfectly adapted to island life. The Bubi became the undisputed masters of Bioko Island, developing a sophisticated agricultural society that took advantage of the island's volcanic soil and favourable climate. They were particularly good at growing crops and managing the island's resources, creating a stable society that lasted for over a millennium before Europeans showed up to complicate everything. The Bubi had their own kings, their own laws, and their own way of doing things that worked perfectly well until outsiders arrived with different ideas about land ownership, labour relations, and the general conduct of human affairs. Meanwhile, the distant island of Annobon has an entirely different origin story. Its population wasn't indigenous to the region at all, but rather consisted of people originally from Angola, who were introduced to the island by Portuguese colonizers via São Tomé Island. This makes Annobon something of an ethnic and cultural outlier in Equatorial Guinea. It's like finding a piece of southern Africa randomly floating in the Gulf of Guinea, which is essentially what happened when the Portuguese decided to use it as a way station in their maritime empire. For over 1,000 years, these various peoples lived their lives relatively undisturbed by the outside world. The Pygmies continued their ancient forest traditions, the Bantu groups on the mainland developed increasingly sophisticated societies, the Bubi created their island kingdom, and Annobon served as a quiet outpost. It was a world that, while certainly not without its conflicts and challenges, operated according to African rhythms and African rules. That peaceful equilibrium was about to be spectacularly disrupted by the arrival of Europeans who were ostensibly looking for a route to India, but somehow kept ending up in places that were demonstrably not India. Enter Fernando Po, not the person, but the Portuguese navigator, whose name would be permanently attached to Bioko Island for the next 500 years. In 1472, Fernão Po became the first European to lay eyes on what is now Bioko Island, and in the grand tradition of European explorers, he immediately named it something European. He called it Formosa, meaning beautiful, though it quickly became known as Fernando Po after its discoverer, because apparently Portuguese explorers had healthy egos and a fondness for geographic immortality. Fernando Po was one of several Portuguese navigators exploring the Gulf of Guinea on behalf of King Afonso V of Portugal, as part of the Great Age of Exploration that was systematically putting European names on places that already had perfectly good local names. These explorers were looking for a sea route to the riches of India and Asia, because apparently walking overland through the Ottoman Empire was too much trouble, and Europeans had decided that sailing around an entire continent was the more reasonable option. The Portuguese initially showed little interest in their new discoveries, treating them as way stations for ships heading to more lucrative destinations in Brazil and Asia. However, the islands became integrated into the Atlantic slave trade, serving as collection centers for enslaved people shipped to the Americas. This trade devastated local populations, particularly the Fang people, whose society was severely weakened despite their strong military organization. For nearly 3 centuries, Portugal maintained nominal control over their Gulf of Guinea territories. In 1778, everything changed with the Treaty of El Pardo. Queen Maria I of Portugal and King Charles III of Spain decided to resolve their territorial disputes by trading real estate across continents like a high-stakes game of Monopoly. Portugal ceded Bioko, Annobon, and mainland commercial rights to Spain in exchange for Spanish withdrawal from disputed Brazilian territories. The actual transfer was a comedy of errors involving tropical diseases and death. Spanish Admiral Felipe José died from fever while taking possession, and his crew mutinied after losing 80% of their men to disease. This disaster left Spain hesitant to invest heavily in their new African possessions, though they did use them for slave trading operations. Between 1778 and 1810, Spain administered Equatorial Guinea through the Viceroyalty in Buenos Aires, which was about as practical as it sounds. The situation became more complicated when Britain established a base on Bioko from 1827 to 1843 to suppress the slave trade. This created the Fernandino community, freed slaves who developed their own Creole culture and language called Pichinglis. After Britain withdrew in 1843, Spain reasserted control and began serious colonial development. The late 19th century brought military campaigns against the Fang people, and the establishment of Spanish Guinea. However, during the scramble for Africa, France grabbed much of Spain's claimed territory. The humiliating Treaty of Paris in 1900 left Spain with only 26,000 square kilometers instead of their original 300,000 square kilometer claim. Despite these setbacks, Spain established effective control over what remained of their African territories, unifying Bioko and Río Muni as Spanish Guinea in 1926. The colonial economy was built on large plantations producing cacao and coffee, along with logging operations. The workforce came primarily from immigrant contract laborers from Liberia, Nigeria, and Cameroon, since the indigenous Bubi population had developed a sensible aversion to plantation work. The treatment of these contract workers was often little better than slavery. A labour treaty with Liberia in 1914 led to the transport of up to 15,000 workers, but an international labour organisation investigation in 1930 discovered that these workers had been recruited under conditions barely distinguishable from slave trading. The revelation led to the prohibition of recruiting Liberian workers, forcing Spanish authorities to increasingly rely on illegal smuggling of workers from Nigeria. By 1942, there were 20,000 clandestine workers on Bioko alone. The Spanish Civil War had significant repercussions for the colony, and when Franco emerged victorious, colonial administration became much more centralized and authoritarian. Franco's regime saw the colony primarily as a source of raw materials rather than a territory-deserving development. By the 1950s, decolonization movements were gaining momentum across Africa, and Spain began to recognize that the colonial era was ending. In 1959, Spanish Guinea was reclassified as a province of Spain, theoretically giving inhabitants Spanish citizenship and representation in the Spanish Parliament, though in practice this was largely symbolic. The territory was reorganized into two provinces, Fernando Po and Río Muni. The move toward independence accelerated in the 1960s under pressure from nationalist movements within Spanish Guinea and from the United Nations, which was systematically pressuring colonial powers to grant independence to their African territories. In 1963, Spain granted limited autonomy under the regime of autonomy, which created a local legislative assembly while maintaining Spanish control over key governance areas. This was intended as a compromise to reduce international pressure while keeping the territory within the Spanish system. The final push toward independence came in 1968 when Spain, under pressure from Equatorial Guinean nationalists and the international community, announced it would grant full independence. The Constitutional Convention was held, producing an electoral law and draft constitution that was approved by 63% of the electorate in a referendum on August 11th. The Constitution provided for a government with a General Assembly and a Supreme Court, establishing the framework for what everyone hoped would be a stable, democratic nation. Francisco Macías Nguema was elected as the first president of Equatorial Guinea in September 1968, and independence was officially granted on October 12, 1968. At independence, Equatorial Guinea had one of the highest per capita incomes in Africa, a relatively well-educated population thanks to Spanish educational efforts, and functioning infrastructure built around the cacao and coffee export economy. The Spanish had developed a good network of healthcare facilities, and the literacy rate was among the highest on the continent. The new nation also inherited a complex ethnic and linguistic landscape shaped by centuries of migration and colonial rule. The Fang people dominated the mainland with their 67 clans and 2 distinct dialects, while the Bubi maintained their stronghold on Bioko Island. The Fernandino Creole community had established itself as an educated middle class, and Spanish had become the language of administration and education. This multilingual, multi-ethnic society would soon face challenges that would test every aspect of its colonial inheritance. Unfortunately, Appearances can be deceiving, and what happened next would prove that sometimes independence can be more catastrophic than colonialism, which is really saying something. But that tale of political disaster will have to wait for our next section, as we've traced Equatorial Guinea from its prehistoric inhabitants through colonial confusion to the threshold of independence. Chapter 3: Independence and the Macías Era of Madness. If you thought the colonial period was a difficult chapter in Equatorial Guinea's story, I'm afraid you're in for quite a shock. Sometimes independence from foreign rule can be worse than the foreign rule itself, and Francisco Macías Nguema's 11-year reign represents one of the most catastrophic examples of post-colonial governance in African history. What happened next in our small nation story makes the Spanish colonial administrators look like benevolent community organizers by comparison, and that's really saying something, considering how exploitative colonial rule had been. Francisco Macías Nguema took office as Equatorial Guinea's first president on October 12, 1968, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the country might actually thrive under independence. After all, Equatorial Guinea had one of the highest per capita incomes in Africa, an educated population, functioning infrastructure, and significant natural resources. Spain had left behind a relatively well-developed plantation economy, decent healthcare facilities, and one of the continent's highest literacy rates. If you were placing bets on which newly independent African nations would succeed, Equatorial Guinea would have been a reasonable choice. Macías himself seemed like an unlikely candidate for future infamy. Born as Mesman Nguema in 1924 in the village of Nzangayong, he had worked his way up through the Spanish colonial administration, serving as a court interpreter, mayor of Mongomo, and eventually deputy president of the governing council. The Spanish authorities had promoted him rapidly, interpreting his role in colonial legal proceedings as evidence of leadership ability, and thinking he would be a compliant leader who would maintain good relations with Spain after independence. This turned out to be one of history's more spectacular misjudgments of character. Even during his rise through the colonial bureaucracy, Macías had displayed some concerning tendencies that probably should have served as warning signs. During a conference in Madrid to discuss independence, he suddenly launched into what witnesses described as an incoherent eulogy of the Nazis, claiming that Adolf Hitler had wanted to save Africans from colonialism, but had gotten confused and tried to conquer Europe instead. This is the kind of statement that should make people slowly back away and reconsider their life choices. But apparently, everyone decided to treat it as an amusing diplomatic quirk, rather than a red flag the size of a football field. The first signs of serious trouble appeared almost immediately after independence. In March 1969, just 5 months into his presidency, Macías arrested his own foreign minister and political rival, Atanasio Ndongo Mione, on treason charges. Rather than holding a trial or following any semblance of legal process, Macías had Ndongo thrown out of a window, a practice known as defenestration that historically has not been associated with good governance. To make matters even more disturbing, Macías took photographs of his dying foreign minister on the street below, and later showed the album to visiting journalists like a particularly macabre vacation slideshow. This murder marked the beginning of what would become a systematic campaign of terror against anyone Macías perceived as a threat, which eventually included virtually everyone in the country with any education, skills, or independent thoughts. He began by targeting political rivals and Spanish residents, demanding that all Spaniards surrender their weapons and abandon their property. The Spanish community, which had numbered in the thousands and included many skilled professionals and managers, fled the country en masse, taking with them much of the technical knowledge needed to keep the economy functioning. By 1972, Macías had abandoned any pretense of democratic governance and declared himself president for life through a constitutional decree that also named him Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Grand Master of Education, Science, and Culture. This last title was particularly ironic, considering that one of his first major policy initiatives was to systematically destroy the country's educational system. He viewed intellectuals, teachers, and educated people as threats to his authority, leading to what can only be described as a war against knowledge itself. The 1973 repeal of the Independence Constitution marked the formal end of any legal constraints on Macías's power. He established his United National Workers' Party, known by its Spanish acronym PUNT, as the only legal political organization in the country. Opposition parties were banned, freedom of speech disappeared entirely, and citizens were forbidden from leaving the country without Macías's personal permission. It was like living in a prison where the warden had decided that reading and thinking were criminal activities. Macías's paranoia and megalomania grew more extreme with each passing year. He assumed increasingly grandiose titles, declaring himself not only president for life but also supreme leader and unique miracle, as if he saw himself as a divine being sent to rule his people. His speeches became increasingly erratic and disconnected from reality, and his behavior suggested someone who was either profoundly mentally ill or had developed such a severe God complex that he could no longer distinguish between his fantasies and the real world. The economic consequences of Macías's rule were catastrophic. Before independence, Equatorial Guinea had been a major cocoa exporter, with plantations that generated substantial revenue and employed thousands of workers. Macías seized all Spanish-owned plantations and handed them over to family members and political cronies who had absolutely no knowledge of agriculture or business management. The predictable result was the complete collapse of the cocoa industry. Equipment broke down, crops rotted in the fields, and export revenues evaporated almost overnight. His anti-intellectual policies made economic recovery impossible. Agricultural experts were banned, imprisoned, or executed, and skilled farmers fled the country in terror. By the mid-1970s, plantations that had once been the backbone of the economy lay in ruins, overgrown with weeds and serving as stark monuments to the destructive power of ideological madness. The country that had once been one of Africa's most prosperous became an economic wasteland where barter replaced currency and starvation replaced prosperity. Education suffered a similar fate. Schools were closed, teachers were imprisoned or executed, and books were burned in public ceremonies that resembled something out of a dystopian nightmare. Macías had decided that Western education was a form of cultural imperialism, and that true African authenticity required rejecting intellectual pursuits altogether. This philosophy might sound vaguely noble in the abstract, but in practice it meant condemning an entire generation to illiteracy and ignorance, while destroying centuries of accumulated human knowledge. The healthcare system collapsed with similar thoroughness. Macías accused doctors of spreading anti-patriotic ideas and forced most medical professionals to flee the country. By the mid-1970s, Equatorial Guinea was left with just 2 doctors to serve the entire nation's population of roughly 300,000 people. Preventable diseases spread unchecked, infant mortality rates skyrocketed, and a cholera epidemic devastated the population. While Macías banned modern medicine as un-African, it's difficult to imagine a more complete abandonment of governmental responsibility for public health. The human rights abuses during this period were staggering. Macías established forced labor camps where perceived enemies were worked to death under deliberately fatal conditions. The popular revolutionary militia became a tool of terror that could arrest, torture, or execute anyone at any time. Torture became routine practice, and Black Beach Prison became synonymous with disappearance and death. Estimates suggest between 20,000 and 80,000 people were killed out of a population of roughly 300,000. This means 7 to 27% of the entire population was murdered by their own government. The ethnic dimension was particularly horrific. Despite being Fang himself, Macías targeted the Bubi people for genocidal persecution, systematically hunting down and executing indigenous Bioko inhabitants. The brain drain was devastating. Over 125,000 people, roughly 40% of the population, fled into exile, seeking refuge in Cameroon, Gabon, and Spain. The country lost doctors, teachers, engineers, and virtually everyone with skills needed to run a modern society. The international community was slow to recognize the catastrophe, partly because Macías had isolated the country from the outside world. By the late 70s, Equatorial Guinea earned the grim nickname the Dachau of Africa, reflecting the systematic violence and industrial scale of killing. Macías's personal behavior became increasingly bizarre. He kept human skulls, was believed to be a sorcerer, and moved the national treasury to a remote hut where he consulted supernatural forces about governance. By 1979, even Macías's closest supporters recognized that his rule threatened national survival. The country had become a failed state, with no functioning economy, government, education, or healthcare. The end came through a family coup when Macías ordered executions of his own relatives, convincing his nephew Teodoro Obiang and others that their survival depended on removing him first. Teodoro Obiang, who served as Deputy Defense Minister and was therefore well positioned to organize military resistance, began planning a coup with other members of Macías's inner circle, who had concluded that their uncle had become too dangerous to be allowed to continue ruling. The irony was thick. The man who had destroyed so many families through suspicion and paranoia was ultimately brought down by his own family members, whom he had trusted with positions of authority. The coup began on August 3, 1979, and developed into a 15-day conflict as loyalist forces attempted to defend Macías, while rebel units seized key installations throughout the country. The fighting killed an estimated 400 people, which by this point seemed almost modest compared to the daily violence of the previous 11 years. Macías fled the capital of Malabo and took refuge in a fortified bunker in his home village of Nzeng Ayong, protected by military loyalists and his personal bodyguard. The end came on August 18th when a force led by naval commander Florencio Maye captured Macías as he attempted to flee to Cameroon. Found hiding in the jungle with suitcases full of money that he had apparently been planning to use to fund his exile, the man who had once declared himself a unique miracle was reduced to a desperate fugitive trying to escape the consequences of his own actions. The symbolism was perfect. The dictator who had ruled through terror ultimately faced the same kind of desperate flight that he had forced on hundreds of thousands of his own people. The trial of Francisco Macías Njema began in September 1979 and became an international sensation as the full scope of his crimes was finally documented in a legal proceeding. He was charged with genocide against the Bubi people, mass murder, embezzlement of public funds, and systematic violations of human rights. The International Commission of Jurists sent observers, and testimony from survivors finally gave the world a complete picture of what had happened during the 11 years of terror. He was found guilty on 474 counts of murder, along with numerous other charges, and was sentenced to death. On September 29, 1979, Francisco Macías Nguema was executed by firing squad, ending one of the most brutal and destructive dictatorships in modern African history. Ironically, no Equatorial Guinean soldier was willing to carry out the execution, fearing a posthumous curse from the man many believed to be a powerful sorcerer. In the end, Moroccan mercenaries were brought in to end the reign of terror that had gripped Equatorial Guinea for 11 years. The legacy of the Macías era was devastating and long-lasting. By the time of his death, Equatorial Guinea's population had been reduced from roughly 300,000 to perhaps half that number through murder and exile. The country's economy had collapsed completely, its institutions had been destroyed, and its human capital had been scattered across the world. An entire generation had grown up without education, healthcare, or any exposure to the modern world. It was like a social science experiment in how quickly a functioning society could be reduced to medieval conditions through determined mismanagement and deliberate brutality. The international community finally began to take notice of Equatorial Guinea's plight, but the damage was already done. Reconstruction would require not just rebuilding physical infrastructure, but recreating an entire society from scratch. The new government under Teodoro Obiang faced the challenge of governing a traumatized population, rebuilding destroyed institutions, and somehow convincing exiled professionals to return to a country that had become synonymous with terror and chaos. Unfortunately, as we'll see in our next section, the end of Macías's reign did not mark the beginning of democracy and prosperity for Equatorial Guinea. The nephew who had overthrown him would prove to have his own ideas about power, governance, and the proper relationship between rulers and the ruled. But that's a story for next time, as we've now witnessed the complete transformation of a promising new nation into a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and ideological extremism. Chapter 4: Oil, Coups, and the Obiang Dynasty. When Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo stepped into power in October 1979, following his uncle's execution, he inherited what could charitably be described as a complete disaster. Equatorial Guinea was a failed state in every conceivable way. The economy had collapsed, the population had been decimated, the educated class had fled or been murdered, and the country's international reputation was somewhere between pariah and cautionary tale. If you were starting a new government under these circumstances, you'd probably want to focus on basic things like feeding people, rebuilding infrastructure, and maybe not terrifying the remaining population. Obiang had different ideas about priorities. Initially, there were some reasons for optimism. Unlike his predecessor, Obiang allowed schools to reopen, didn't declare war on books and medicine, and seemed to understand that a country needed at least some functional institutions to operate. The early 1980s saw a gradual return to something resembling normal life, which, considering what normal had been under Macías, was admittedly a very low bar to clear. Refugees began trickling back from neighbouring countries, markets reopened, and people could once again walk down the street without worrying about being arrested for the crime of existing while literate. Obiang established a supreme military council to govern the country, adding some civilians to the council in 1981 in what appeared to be a gesture toward more inclusive governance. A new constitution was drafted in 1982 with assistance from the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, which seemed like a promising development. The constitution provided for a 7-year presidential term and outlined various governmental structures, though it also granted Obiang sweeping powers that essentially made him a legal dictator. This was perhaps a clue about where things were heading. The 1980s and early 90s saw Obiang making various gestures toward democratic reform, though these were more like democratic theatre than actual democracy. In 1983, 41 unopposed candidates were elected to the legislature, which is the kind of election result that makes you wonder if they understood what the word election means. A new constitution in 1991 provided for a multi-party state and led to the first multi-party elections in 1993, but there was never any real indication that Obiang intended to give up power voluntarily. Obiang founded the Democratic Party of Equatorial Guinea, known by its Spanish acronym PDGE, in 1987. The PDGE became the ruling party and has remained so ever since. winning elections by the kind of margins that would make Soviet-era politicians blush. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Obiang and his party repeatedly won re-election by lopsided margins in ballots that were about as credible as a carnival game. We're talking about victory percentages in the high 90s, which is mathematically possible, but about as likely as being struck by lightning while winning the lottery twice in the same day. The pattern was always the same. Opposition candidates would withdraw citing threats, ballot boxes would be stuffed, and voting would occur in public rather than through secret ballot. Opposition parties eventually boycotted elections because participating in electoral theatre seemed pointless. It was democracy like professional wrestling is competitive sport, technically meeting the definition, but with predetermined outcomes. Throughout this period, Obiang claimed to face numerous coup attempts, though most couldn't be independently verified. The most notable was the Wonga coup of 2004, involving European and South African mercenaries led by former British SAS officer Simon Mann. Financial backers included Sir Mark Thatcher, son of former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. The coup failed when mercenaries were arrested in Zimbabwe, leading to international embarrassment and demonstrating that Obiang's security was more competent than his uncle's. But the real transformation of Equatorial Guinea came not through political reform or democratic development, but through a geological accident that would reshape the country's destiny forever. In 1995, Mobil Corporation struck oil in the Zafiro field off Bioko Island, and almost overnight, Equatorial Guinea went from being a forgotten African basket case to one of the continent's most significant oil producers. It was like winning the geological lottery, except the ticket was purchased with decades of suffering, and the winnings would prove to be more complicated than anyone expected. The discovery of the Zafiro field was genuinely remarkable from a technical perspective. The field contained an estimated 1.1 billion barrels of recoverable oil, making it one of the largest discoveries in West Africa. By August 1996, just 18 months after the initial discovery, production had reached 40,000 barrels per day. Within a few years, the field was producing over 200,000 barrels daily, transforming Equatorial Guinea from a minor economic player into Africa's third largest oil producer behind only Nigeria and Angola. The speed of development was unprecedented. Mobil converted a very large crude carrier into a floating production storage and offloading vessel called the Zafiro Producer, creating one of the most advanced offshore oil production facilities in Africa. The technical aspects were cutting edge, the investment was massive, and the results were spectacular. Production from the Zafiro field peaked in 2004 at around 280,000 barrels per day, generating enormous revenues for a country that had previously struggled to export enough cocoa to pay for basic imports. The economic transformation was staggering. Between 1997 and 2001, Equatorial Guinea experienced an average GDP growth of 41.6% per year, which is the kind of economic growth rate that makes economists check their calculators multiple times. By the early 2000s, the country had gone from having one of the lowest per capita incomes in Africa to having one of the highest. For a brief period, Equatorial Guinea was actually richer per capita than many European countries, which is quite an achievement for a nation that had been synonymous with poverty and dysfunction just a few years earlier. The oil boom attracted other international companies beyond Mobil. American firms discovered additional fields, while Marathon Oil developed the Alba gas field. Foreign investment flooded in, bringing technology, expertise, and billions in capital. For the first time since independence, Equatorial Guinea received international attention for positive rather than disastrous reasons. However, virtually none of the benefits reached ordinary people. While GDP statistics looked impressive, oil revenues were systematically diverted to Obiang and his inner circle. It was like a lottery jackpot where only one person claims the prize, except that person already controlled the government and military. The pattern of corruption was both systematic and brazen. Oil companies were required to make payments to government officials and their families as part of doing business in the country. Key positions in the government and state oil company were filled by Obiang's relatives and clan members from Mongomo. Revenue streams were diverted through complex networks of shell companies and foreign bank accounts, making it nearly impossible for international observers to track where the money was actually going. The most visible symbol was Obiang's son, Teodoro Teodorin, Nuema Obiang Mangay, infamous for his extravagant lifestyle funded by state embezzlement. Teodorin accumulated luxury cars, private jets, yachts, and global real estate. International investigations revealed mansions in Malibu, Paris, and Cape Town, plus artwork worth millions. French authorities seized tens of millions in assets, revealing a global network funded by systematically looted state resources. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens saw little improvement despite the country's oil power status. Most lacked clean water, electricity, healthcare, and education. The oil wealth funded prestige projects like government buildings and luxury hotels, rather than improving conditions for citizens. A new capital city was built in the rainforest, while rural schools remained without electricity and hospitals lacked basic supplies. The international community's response to this situation was complicated, to put it mildly. On one hand, international organizations regularly condemned Equatorial Guinea's human rights record and the obvious corruption surrounding oil revenues. On the other hand, the country's oil production was too valuable to ignore, and major oil companies continued to invest billions of dollars in Equatorial Guinea's energy sector, while maintaining that they were just business enterprises rather than political actors. The discovery of oil also changed Equatorial Guinea's international relationships in significant ways. The country joined OPEC in 2017, giving it a voice in global oil markets that was disproportionate to its size. Relationships with major powers became increasingly transactional, with countries like the United States and China competing for access to Equatorial Guinea's energy resources, while downplaying concerns about governance and human rights. It was realpolitik at its most cynical, where oil reserves mattered more than democratic principles. Obiang used the oil revenues strategically to consolidate his power and prepare for dynastic succession. In 2012, he appointed Teodorin as second vice president, a position that hadn't existed before and was clearly designed to position his son as his eventual successor. The constitutional changes made in 2011 included provisions for a vice presidency and term limits, but these were crafted in ways that actually strengthened rather than limited presidential power. It was constitutional reform designed to create the appearance of democratization while actually entrenching authoritarian rule. The oil boom also enabled Obiang to build a more sophisticated security apparatus than his uncle had possessed. Better pay and equipment for the military and police, along with extensive surveillance capabilities, made coup attempts much more difficult to organize and execute. The regime could afford to buy loyalty through patronage while simultaneously deterring opposition through more subtle forms of repression than the crude terror tactics of the Macías era. It was authoritarianism with better public relations and more sustainable financing. By the 2010s, it was clear that the oil discovery had fundamentally changed Equatorial Guinea, but not necessarily in ways that benefited the broader population. The country had become wealthy on paper, while remaining poor in practice, developed modern extractive industries, while failing to build sustainable economic institutions, and achieved international recognition while maintaining domestic repression. It was a textbook example of the resource curse, where natural wealth becomes a tool for authoritarian consolidation rather than national development. Recent years have brought new challenges as oil production has begun declining and international pressure has increased. ExxonMobil announced its exit from Equatorial Guinea in 2024, ending nearly 3 decades of operations and signalling that the easy oil boom years may be coming to an end. Production from the Zafiro field has declined significantly from its peak, and new discoveries have become increasingly rare. The economic model that sustained the Obiang regime for decades may need fundamental changes, though there's little sign that the government is preparing for a post-oil future. As we look at modern Equatorial Guinea, it's clear that the oil discovery was both a blessing and a curse for the small nation. It provided enormous wealth that could have transformed the country into a prosperous, developed state. Instead, it became a tool for entrenching authoritarian rule and enabling unprecedented levels of corruption. The Obiang dynasty has now ruled for over 40 years, making Teodoro Obiang one of the world's longest-serving leaders and creating a political system where power is treated as hereditary property rather than public service. The story of oil and the Obiang dynasty illustrates one of the great ironies of African development. Sometimes the discovery of valuable natural resources can be worse for a country's people than having no resources at all. In our next section, we'll explore the geographical features that made this oil wealth possible and examine the environmental and social landscapes that have been shaped by decades of extraction and authoritarian rule. Because understanding Equatorial Guinea means understanding not just its political history, but the physical geography that has made both its promise and its problems possible. Chapter 5: Geography. Where rainforest meets the sea. Now that we understand how Equatorial Guinea's political and economic fortunes have been shaped by the discovery of oil, it's time to explore the remarkable geography that made this transformation possible. This small nation sits in one of the most geologically and biologically fascinating corners of Africa, where ancient volcanic forces, tropical rainforests, and offshore sedimentary basins have created a landscape that is both breathtakingly beautiful and incredibly valuable. Understanding Equatorial Guinea's geography means appreciating how millions of years of geological processes created the perfect conditions for both extraordinary biodiversity and massive hydrocarbon deposits, a combination that has defined the country's modern destiny. Let's start with the most striking feature of Equatorial Guinea's geography, the fundamental separation between the mainland and the islands. The country consists of 2 completely different geological worlds, separated by up to 600 kilometers of open ocean. Río Muni, the mainland region, represents ancient continental Africa with its crystalline basement rocks and rolling hills covered in dense rainforest. Meanwhile, the islands, particularly Bioko, are volcanic formations that rose from the seafloor as part of a geological phenomenon known as the Cameroon Volcanic Line, a chain of volcanoes stretching from the Atlantic Ocean deep into Central Africa. Bioko Island is perhaps the most geographically dramatic part of Equatorial Guinea, shaped by volcanic forces that created a landscape of almost mythical proportions. The island rises from the sea like a massive natural skyscraper, with 3 major volcanic peaks dominating the terrain. Pico Basile, the highest point in the country at 3,011 meters above sea level, towers over the northern part of the island like a geological monument to the power of volcanic activity. From its peak, you can see both the mainland coast of Africa and the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, making it one of the few places on Earth where you can simultaneously view an entire nation and contemplate geological timescales. The volcanic nature of Bioko has created some of the most fertile soils in Africa, which explains why the island became the center of colonial plantation agriculture. Volcanic soil is rich in minerals and nutrients that support incredibly productive agriculture. The Spanish developed Bioko into a major producer of cocoa and coffee, crops that thrived in the volcanic soil and tropical climate. The island's topography is remarkably diverse for such a small area. The southern shores are steep and rugged, with cliffs dropping directly into the Atlantic, while the northern coast offers gentler beaches and excellent harbours that made Malabo an important West African port. Climbing from sea level to the volcanic peaks, you experience different ecosystems arranged in bands according to elevation. At sea level, you find coastal mangroves and lowland rainforests. As you ascend, these give way to montane rainforests adapted to cooler temperatures. Above 600 meters, tropical rainforest transitions into cloud forests with constant mist creating otherworldly environments. Finally, at the highest elevations, you reach montane grasslands where vegetation consists mainly of grasses and lichens. This altitudinal diversity has made Bioko a biological treasure trove, with over 1,000 plant species, many endemic to these volcanic slopes. The drill monkey, found only on Bioko and mainland Cameroon, represents one of several endemic primate species that make the island one of Africa's most important centres of primate diversity. The mainland region of Río Muni presents a completely different geological story. This is continental Africa in its classic form, ancient crystalline rocks worn down by hundreds of millions of years of erosion into a landscape of rolling hills and river valleys. The terrain consists primarily of Precambrian metamorphic rocks, including gneiss and schists that formed during some of the earliest chapters of Earth's geological history. These rocks have been weathered and eroded for so long that the resulting soils, while not as fertile as Bioko's volcanic earth, support some of the most magnificent tropical rainforests on the planet. Río Muni is part of the Congo Basin rainforest, the second largest tropical forest in the world after the Amazon. This is rainforest on an almost incomprehensible scale, a continuous canopy of green that stretches from the Atlantic coast deep into the heart of Africa, supporting an estimated 30 million people and containing more biodiversity per square kilometre than almost anywhere else on Earth. The trees here grow to massive proportions, with some species reaching heights of over 50 metres and forming a canopy so dense that very little sunlight reaches the forest floor. The rainforest of Río Muni contains over 140 different tree species, including commercially valuable okume, African walnut, and various mahoganies. The wildlife reads like a catalogue of Africa's most iconic species: forest elephants, western lowland gorillas, chimpanzees, leopards, and forest buffalo move through this green wilderness, though populations have been severely reduced by hunting and habitat loss. The coastal areas feature extensive mangrove forests, remarkably productive ecosystems where plants have adapted to live in salt water. These forests serve as marine fish nurseries, protect coastlines from erosion, and support complex food webs including birds, reptiles, and countless invertebrates. The climate of Equatorial Guinea is exactly what you'd expect from a country whose name includes the word equatorial, consistently hot and humid throughout the year, with temperatures that rarely vary more than a few degrees from the annual average of 25 degrees Celsius. This is the kind of climate where seasonal variation is measured more by rainfall than temperature, and where the concept of winter clothing is purely theoretical. The humidity typically ranges from 90 to 100%, which means that everything feels slightly damp all the time, and mold becomes a constant adversary for anyone trying to preserve books, photographs, or electronic equipment. Rainfall in Equatorial Guinea is both abundant and dramatically variable depending on location and season. The coastal areas receive the most precipitation, with some locations recording over 4,000 millimetres of rain per year. That's more than 13 feet of water falling from the sky annually. To put this in perspective, that's about 4 times the annual rainfall of London and twice the annual rainfall of Seattle, two cities famous for being rainy. The rain doesn't fall evenly throughout the year, but comes in distinct wet and dry seasons that govern the rhythms of life for both humans and wildlife. The mainland experiences 2 wet seasons, from February to June and from September to December, with relatively drier periods in between. However, dry season in equatorial Africa doesn't mean the absence of rain, it just means slightly less rain. Even during the driest months, you can expect significant precipitation, and the forest maintains its lush green appearance year-round. Bioko Island has a somewhat different pattern, with the wettest months typically running from July through January, making seasonal planning rather complicated for anyone trying to coordinate activities between the mainland and the islands. This abundant rainfall is what makes the extraordinary biodiversity of Equatorial Guinea possible. The combination of constant warmth, high humidity, and reliable precipitation creates ideal conditions for plant growth, which in turn supports the complex food webs that make tropical rainforests the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. However, this same climate can be challenging for human activities, particularly agriculture and infrastructure development. Buildings require constant maintenance to prevent deterioration from moisture and humidity. Roads wash out during heavy rains, and anything made of metal rusts with remarkable speed. The offshore geology tells the story of how oil deposits formed. Sedimentary basins beneath the Gulf of Guinea contain millions of years of organic material buried under sediment layers and transformed into petroleum through heat and pressure. These basins formed during continental breakup when Africa and South America separated during the Cretaceous period, creating perfect geological conditions for oil formation. The Zafiro field, which has been the cornerstone of Equatorial Guinea's oil industry, lies in water depths ranging from 400 to 800 feet, deep enough to require sophisticated offshore drilling technology, but not so deep as to make extraction prohibitively expensive. The field is located 42 miles northwest of Bioko Island, positioned perfectly to take advantage of both the geological formations that contain the oil and the infrastructure on Bioko that supports the industry. It's a geological jackpot that required millions of years to form and just a few years to discover and develop. The environmental challenges facing Equatorial Guinea's remarkable geography are both natural and human-made. Climate change is beginning to affect rainfall patterns and temperature regimes, potentially disrupting the delicate balance that supports the country's extraordinary biodiversity. Rising sea levels threaten coastal mangrove forests and the low-lying areas where much of the population lives. More immediate threats come from human activities. Logging is fragmenting the rainforest, overhunting is reducing wildlife populations, and oil extraction is creating new pressures on marine ecosystems. The bushmeat trade represents a particular threat to Equatorial Guinea's wildlife. Traditional hunting for subsistence has been replaced in many areas by commercial hunting that supplies urban markets and even international demand. Species like drills, chimpanzees, and forest elephants are being hunted faster than their populations can recover, threatening to eliminate some of Africa's most important wildlife from large areas of their range. The irony is that oil wealth has made it easier for people to purchase firearms and vehicles, inadvertently making hunting more efficient and more destructive than traditional methods. Logging presents another major challenge. While Equatorial Guinea's forests contain valuable timber species, the methods used for extraction often cause far more damage than necessary. Road building to access timber opens up previously pristine forest areas to hunting and settlement, creating a cascade of environmental impacts that extend far beyond the trees that are actually cut down. The okume and mahogany trees that are most valuable commercially are also among the most important species for supporting forest ecosystems, so their removal can have disproportionate impacts on biodiversity. Despite these challenges, Equatorial Guinea has taken some important steps toward conservation. The country has established several national parks and protected areas, including Monte Allen National Park on the mainland and various reserves on Bioko Island. Monte Allen, covering 1,400 square kilometers, protects habitat for over 100 mammal species, including elephants, gorillas, and chimpanzees. The park represents one of the most important protected areas in Central Africa, though enforcement and management remain significant challenges. The geographic isolation that makes Equatorial Guinea unique, separated between mainland and islands, with most of the population concentrated on a volcanic island 40 kilometers from the continental coast, also creates logistical challenges that affect everything from governance to economic development. Getting people and goods between Malabo and the mainland requires either flights or boat trips, both of which are subject to weather delays and mechanical problems. This geographic separation has contributed to the political dominance of the Fang ethnic group from the mainland, even though the capital city is located on Bioko Island, which is traditionally Bubi territory. Looking at Equatorial Guinea's geography, it's impossible not to be struck by the contrasts and contradictions that define this remarkable country. Here is a place where ancient volcanic forces created some of the most fertile land in Africa, where geological processes spanning hundreds of millions of years created valuable oil deposits, where rainforests support extraordinary biodiversity, and where geography has both enabled great wealth and complicated its distribution. Understanding Equatorial Guinea means understanding how physical geography shapes human possibilities, both opportunities and constraints. The geography that has given Equatorial Guinea its oil wealth and biological richness has also created challenges that will define the country's future. Climate change, environmental degradation, and resource depletion are all geographic realities that require geographic solutions. Conservation strategies that work with rather than against natural systems, economic development that recognizes ecological limits, and governance systems that can manage resources across the complex geographical realities of islands and mainland, forest and sea, local communities, and global markets. As we prepare to explore the human dimensions of life in modern Equatorial Guinea, it's worth remembering that geography is not just backdrop, it's an active force that continues to shape everything from daily life to national politics. The volcanic peaks of Bioko, the rainforests of Río Muni, and the offshore oil fields continue to influence how people live, work, and imagine their future in this small but geographically extraordinary corner of Africa. Chapter 6: Culture, Language and Life in Modern Equatorial Guinea. As our journey through Equatorial Guinea draws to a close, we turn to the human story, the daily realities, cultural richness, and contemporary challenges facing the nearly 2 million people who call this remarkable country home. This is a tale of linguistic diversity in a globalized world, of ancient traditions adapting to modern pressures, and of profound contradictions between national wealth and individual poverty. Understanding modern Equatorial Guinea means grappling with questions that extend far beyond Africa. How does a country preserve cultural identity while navigating colonial legacies? What happens when extraordinary natural wealth fails to translate into widespread prosperity? And how do people maintain hope and community in the face of systemic challenges? Let's begin with something truly unique about Equatorial Guinea. It is the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa. This linguistic distinction makes it an outlier not just on the African continent, but in the entire Spanish-speaking world. The story of how Spanish became dominant in this small Central African nation reflects the complex cultural layers that define modern Equatorial Guinean identity. About 87% of the population speaks Spanish, making it far more than just an official language imposed by colonial authorities. It has become a genuine part of national culture. The Spanish you hear in Malabo or Bata, however, isn't quite the same Spanish spoken in Madrid or Mexico City. Equatorial Guinean Spanish has developed its own characteristics, influenced by local languages, unique historical experiences, and geographic isolation from other Spanish-speaking regions. Well-educated Equatorial Guineans speak what linguists call Castilian Spanish, with the traditional peninsular pronunciation, including the distinctive lisp that marks educated speech in Spain. But even formal Spanish in Equatorial Guinea incorporates words, phrases, and grammatical structures borrowed from Fang, Bubi, and other indigenous languages. This linguistic fusion reflects deeper cultural realities. Spanish serves as the common language that allows a Fang speaker from the mainland to communicate with a Bubi speaker from Bioko Island, but it doesn't replace the rich tapestry of indigenous languages that remain central to cultural identity. The Fang language, spoken by about 80% of the population, actually consists of two major dialects, Fang Tumu in the northern part of Río Muni and Fang Oka in the south. While these dialects are mutually intelligible, they reflect subtle cultural and historical differences within the broader Fang community. The Bubi people of Bioko Island, who constitute about 15% of the population, maintain their own language and distinct cultural traditions despite centuries of external pressure. Bubi culture is matriarchal, meaning that people trace their lineage through their mother's family line, which contrasts sharply with the patriarchal traditions of the mainland Fang. In traditional Bubi society, families without daughters faced the prospect of lineage extinction, leading to the cultural saying that girls are ke nobo I chobo, the paper that perpetuates the family. This fundamental difference in kinship systems creates interesting dynamics in modern Equatorial Guinea, where political power rests primarily with Fang communities, but the capital city is located on traditionally Bubi territory. The linguistic landscape became even more complex when Equatorial Guinea adopted French as a second official language in 1997 and Portuguese as a third in 2007. These additions weren't driven by large populations of speakers but by strategic considerations. French for closer ties with neighbouring Francophone countries, Portuguese for membership in the community of Portuguese language countries. This creates fascinating educational dynamics. Students learn Spanish as primary instruction language, study French as mandatory second language, and are exposed to Portuguese, while families often speak indigenous languages at home. Children switch effortlessly between Spanish for school, Fang or Bubi for family, and perhaps French for regional communication. The coastal communities add another layer of linguistic complexity. The Playeros or beach people, including the Coms, Balengues, and Bengas, maintain their own languages and cultural practices along the shoreline. On Bioko Island, the Fernandino community speaks a Creole language called Pichinglis that blends English, Spanish, and local languages, reflecting their unique history as descendants of freed slaves and West African immigrants who arrived during the British colonial period in the 19th century. Meanwhile, the tiny island of Anobon is home to speakers of Fadambo, a Portuguese-based Creole that serves as a linguistic bridge to São Tomé and Príncipe. This remarkable linguistic diversity exists within a population of less than 2 million people spread across islands and mainland territories. It's like having a linguistic laboratory where multiple language families, colonial influences, and indigenous traditions converge in a relatively small space. For visitors, it means that the language you hear can change dramatically depending on where you are, who you're talking to, and what the social context might be. The cultural traditions of Equatorial Guinea reflect this same rich diversity. Music and dance are central to both Fang and Bubi cultures, with many songs and dances carrying deep religious and social significance. Traditional instruments include various types of drums, wooden xylophones, bow harps, zithers, and the sanza, a small thumb piano made from bamboo that creates delicate melodic sounds. The accompaniment to traditional dances usually involves 3 or 4 musicians working together to create complex rhythmic patterns that can continue for hours during celebrations and ceremonies. The Balele dance is traditionally performed during Christmas and other major holidays, while the Ibanga serves as the Fang national dance and is popular along the coastal areas. The movements of Ibanga are highly stylized and often quite sensual, with performers covering their bodies in white powder as part of the ceremonial preparation. These traditional performances aren't just entertainment, they serve important social functions, reinforcing community bonds, marking life transitions, and connecting contemporary communities to ancestral traditions. Religious life reflects complex layering of beliefs. About 80% identify as Roman Catholic, legacy of Spanish missionary activity, but this often incorporates traditional African spiritual practices. Protestant denominations account for another 5%, while traditional religions continue influencing daily life, even among nominal Christians. Family structures vary significantly between groups. Fang society is patriarchal and polygynous, with exogamous marriage creating networks across geographical areas. Bubi structures follow matriarchal patterns with endogamous practices, emphasizing maternal relationships over paternal ones. The realities of daily life in modern Equatorial Guinea present some of the starkest contradictions you'll find anywhere in the world. This is a country with one of the highest per capita GDP figures in Africa, higher than Italy, South Korea, or Saudi Arabia. Yet about 2/3 of the population lives below the poverty line. It's a nation that generates billions of dollars annually from oil exports, while roughly half the population lacks access to clean drinking water. These aren't statistical anomalies, they're the lived reality for most Equatorial Guineans. In urban areas like Malabo and Bata, you can observe these contradictions firsthand. Modern office buildings, luxury hotels, and government complexes exist alongside neighborhoods where people live in houses constructed from mud, thatch, and discarded materials. The oil industry has created a small class of wealthy Equatorial Guineans and expatriate workers who live in conditions that rival those in wealthy countries, while the majority of urban residents struggle with inadequate housing, limited electricity, and unreliable water supplies. Education represents another area where national statistics hide more than they reveal. Equatorial Guinea reports literacy rates of about 86%, which looks respectable compared to many African countries. However, this figure masks enormous gender disparities. The average female receives only about 1/5 as much formal schooling as the average male. The education system suffers from inadequate infrastructure, shortages of qualified teachers, and limited resources that make quality education inaccessible for much of the population. The country has one university, the Universidad Nacional de Guinea Equatorial, with a main campus in Malabo and a faculty of medicine in Bata, but the university struggles with limited funding, outdated equipment, and difficulties attracting and retaining qualified faculty. Most families who can afford it send their children abroad for higher education, particularly to Spain, France, or other Spanish-speaking countries. This creates a brain drain where the most educated Equatorial Guineans often remain abroad after completing their studies, depriving the country of the human capital it needs for development. Healthcare presents similar challenges. Despite oil wealth, basic health indicators remain far below expectations for an upper-middle income nation. Only 1 in 4 newborns were immunized for major diseases in 2015, among the world's lowest rates. The allocation problem is stark. Between 2009 and 2013, the government spent $4 billion annually on infrastructure, but only about $140 million on education and $92 million on health. For every $100 in the budget, 80 goes to construction, only 2 to 3 each for health and education. Youth unemployment represents a serious challenge where 60% of the population is under 25. The oil economy employs few workers and depends on skilled foreign labour. Young people lack skills for oil sector jobs and find limited opportunities elsewhere. Agriculture has deteriorated due to lack of investment and urban migration. Urban migration has created additional social pressures as cities struggle to accommodate growing populations. Malabo, built originally as a small colonial administrative centre, now hosts hundreds of thousands of people in circumstances it was never designed to handle. Infrastructure can't keep pace with population growth, leading to overcrowded housing, inadequate sanitation, traffic congestion, and social tensions between different ethnic groups competing for limited resources. Crime has become an increasingly serious issue, particularly among urban youth who see few legitimate opportunities for advancement. In 2022, President Obiang launched Operación Limpieza, Operation Cleanup, deploying nearly 1,000 police officers to impose nighttime curfews on adolescents in response to rising rates of domestic burglary and violent crime, committed by youth gangs. The operation reflects growing social tensions and the government's preference for security solutions over addressing underlying economic and social problems. Gender inequality remains entrenched despite legal guarantees. Women are often treated as second-class citizens, expected to defer to men. Violence against women is common and often unpunished. The digital divide affects education and economic opportunities. Food security remains challenging despite national wealth, with many families experiencing seasonal malnutrition. Environmental degradation threatens biodiverse ecosystems through logging, hunting, and oil activities. The bushmeat trade has intensified as urban populations grew and firearms became accessible. Despite these formidable challenges, Equatorial Guinean communities demonstrate remarkable resilience and cultural creativity. Traditional festivals and ceremonies continue to mark important occasions, bringing communities together and maintaining connections to ancestral traditions. Extended family networks provide social support that government services often can't match. Local markets create informal economic opportunities that support many families. Community organizations, often linked to churches or traditional authorities, work to address problems that formal government institutions struggle to handle. Cultural adaptation continues as Equatorial Guineans navigate between traditional practices and contemporary realities. Young people create new forms of music that blend traditional rhythms with contemporary styles, write literature that explores themes of identity and belonging, and develop artistic expressions that reflect their unique position as Africans in the Spanish-speaking world. These cultural innovations don't just preserve tradition, they create new traditions that speak to contemporary experiences. As Equatorial Guinea faces an uncertain future with declining oil production and the need to develop alternative economic strategies, the country's cultural diversity and linguistic skills may prove to be valuable assets. The ability to navigate between African and European cultural systems, to communicate in multiple languages, and to adapt traditional institutions to contemporary challenges represents a form of social capital that can't be measured in GDP statistics. The story of modern Equatorial Guinea ultimately raises fundamental questions about development, governance, and human potential. Here is a country blessed with extraordinary natural wealth, remarkable cultural diversity, and a population with demonstrated resilience and adaptability. Yet systemic governance failures have prevented this potential from being realized for the benefit of ordinary citizens. The challenge for Equatorial Guinea's future lies not in discovering new resources, but in finding ways to translate existing wealth into genuine human development. As our journey through Equatorial Guinea concludes, we're left with a profound appreciation for the complexity and contradictions that define this small but significant African nation. From the volcanic peaks of Bioko to the rainforests of Río Muni, from the trauma of dictatorship to the promise of oil wealth, from the preservation of indigenous languages to the challenges of global integration, Equatorial Guinea embodies many of the fundamental questions facing Africa and the world in the 21st century. Understanding this remarkable country means understanding something essential about how geography, history, culture, and politics interact to shape human possibilities in our interconnected but unequal world.